I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and my Sixth Amendment right to counsel.
You can call your lawyer from the station, hotshot. Right now, you're in my custody.
That is a direct violation of my Miranda rights, officer.
You're going to talk when I tell you to.
The Saturday morning sun cast a gentle golden glow over the manicured lawns of Oak Creek Estates, a neighborhood where the loudest sound was typically the rhythmic whir of a sprinkler or the distant laughter of children. For Marcus Johnson, this tranquility was the very reason he'd worked 2 jobs for a decade to afford a home here. At 42, he was a man who found profound joy in the simple, quiet order of things. His graphic design business, run from a sunlit room in his house, provided a comfortable living, but his true passion was in the soil. His rose bushes were legendary on the block, a riot of color and fragrance that he tended to with the precision of an artist and the patience of a saint. This morning was no different. Dressed in a worn-out college sweatshirt and cargo shorts, Marcus was on his knees by the flower bed, a pair of pruning shears in one hand and a steaming mug of coffee resting on the porch step beside him. He was humming a quiet tune, completely absorbed in the delicate task of trimming away a few yellowed leaves from his prize-winning peace roses. He had lived in this house for 5 years, and in that time he had become a beloved, if quiet, fixture of the community. He was the man who always had a friendly wave for joggers, the one who'd use his design skills to create flyers for the annual neighborhood bake sale for free, and the neighbor who'd help old Mr. Henderson carry his groceries from his car. He was respected, liked, and utterly unassuming. His life was a testament to hard work and quiet dignity. There was nothing about Marcus Johnson, his gentle demeanor, his meticulously kept home, his modest sedan parked neatly in the driveway, that could ever suggest trouble. He was the embodiment of the peaceful suburban dream, a man at ease in his own skin and in his own front yard. The air was sweet with the smell of cut grass and blooming jasmine, and for Marcus, the world felt perfectly in balance. He had no way of knowing that a storm was gathering just a few blocks away, a storm in the form of a man whose worldview was the polar opposite of his own, and that this storm was heading directly for his peaceful sanctuary. The commotion, when it began, was not a loud crash or a siren's wail, but the jarring intrusion of a police cruiser pulling up with an unnatural abruptness, its tires crunching on the asphalt at the edge of his driveway. Marcus paused, shears in hand, and looked up, a mild curiosity on his face. He assumed it was just an officer on a routine patrol, perhaps turning around. He offered a small, polite nod, the universal sign of a law-abiding citizen acknowledging law enforcement. But the cruiser didn't move on. The driver's side door swung open, and Officer Ryan Cole stepped out, his movements stiff with an authority that seemed too large for the quiet morning. Cole was 36, with a blocky, athletic build and a haircut so severe it looked like a helmet. He had a reputation within his precinct, though not the kind that earned medals. He was known for his short temper, his aggressive stops, and a particular disdain for anyone who didn't fit his narrow, prejudiced idea of who belonged in neighborhoods like this one. He surveyed Marcus's property not with the observant eye of a peacekeeper, but with the predatory gaze of a wolf, scanning a flock of sheep, searching for one to single out. Marcus slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. He felt a flicker of unease, a cold premonition that was entirely foreign to his weekend routine. The officer's posture was all wrong. It wasn't relaxed or observant. It was confrontational. His hand was resting on the butt of his holstered firearm, a gesture of casual intimidation that was completely out of place on this sun-drenched street. Marcus remained by his rose bushes, waiting. He had done nothing wrong, so he had nothing to fear. It was a simple, logical equation that had governed his entire life. But he was about to learn a brutal lesson. In the face of irrational hatred, logic and innocence offer no protection. Officer Cole took a few deliberate, heavy steps onto the perfectly manicured lawn, his polished black boots leaving imprints in the soft grass. The serenity of the morning was already broken, the quiet hum of the neighborhood replaced by a tense silence. A curtain twitched in the window of the house across the street. Another neighbor, watering his petunias 2 doors down, paused his chore. The performance was about to begin, and Officer Ryan Cole had already cast Marcus Johnson in the leading role of the villain, without his consent and without a shred of evidence. Officer Ryan Cole's Saturday shift had been mind-numbingly dull. For 5 hours, he had done little more than cruise through the affluent, tree-lined streets of the city's North End, a district where the crime rate was so low it was a punchline back at the station. He'd handled a call about a cat stuck in a tree and mediated a dispute between 2 elderly neighbors about a property line. This wasn't policing, it was babysitting. Cole craved action, confrontation, the surge of adrenaline that came from asserting his dominance. He had joined the force not out of a noble desire to serve and protect, but because the badge and the gun gave him a power he felt was his birthright. He saw the world in stark, simple terms. There were predators, and there were prey, and he was determined to be the former. His frustration grew with every passing minute of uneventful patrol. He was a hammer in a world that stubbornly refused to present him with any nails. So, he decided to create one. The call had come over the radio 20 minutes earlier. It was a low-priority dispatch, the kind most officers would have ignored or handled with a quick drive-by. A woman calling from a downtown cafe reported that her designer handbag had been stolen. She was hysterical, claiming it was a limited edition piece worth a small fortune. She gave a vague description of the suspect. A black man, maybe in his 40s, wearing dark clothes. That was it. No height, no weight, no distinguishing features. The dispatcher logged it as a petty theft with little chance of being solved. But for Ryan Cole, those few words were not a dead end. They were an opportunity. A black man. In his warped mind, that description was a license to hunt. The fact that Oak Creek Estates was miles away from the downtown cafe was an irrelevant detail. The fact that the neighborhood was overwhelmingly white only made his mission clearer. Any black man he saw here was, by his twisted logic, inherently suspicious and out of place. He began to patrol the quiet streets not with the goal of finding a specific suspect, but with the intent of finding any target that fit his prejudice. He spotted Marcus Johnson from 2 blocks away, a black man in his 40s wearing a dark sweatshirt. It was a perfect match, not to the actual suspect description, but to the caricature of a criminal Cole carried in his head. The sight of Marcus, so clearly at ease tending to his flowers in front of a beautiful, expensive home, didn't register as a sign of a hard-working homeowner. Instead, it triggered a deep-seated resentment in Cole's mind. It was an affront to his sense of order. People like that didn't belong here. They were invaders, anomalies. The stolen handbag, which he had all but forgotten, suddenly became the perfect pretext. It was the key that would allow him to unlock the confrontation he so desperately craved. He didn't radio in his location. He didn't call for backup. He didn't follow protocol by attempting to verify any information. He simply saw his target, fabricated a justification, and initiated his attack. This wasn't an investigation, it was a planned ambush fueled by racial animus. As he stepped out of his car, Cole's heart began to beat a little faster, the familiar rush of power coursing through him. He was in complete control. He was the law, and the man on his knees in the dirt was nothing. He had done this dance a dozen times before. He knew how to use his uniform, his voice, and the threat of violence to intimidate and dominate. He would ask questions he already knew the answers to, dismiss any explanations, and escalate the situation until he could justify putting his hands on his target. The complaints filed against him in the past had all been buried by the department's Internal Affairs Division, dismissed as misunderstandings or the fabrications of disgruntled criminals. The system had always protected him. It had taught him that he was untouchable. As he walked across that perfect green lawn, leaving deep imprints with every step, he felt a supreme sense of confidence. He was about to remind this man of his place. He was about to impose his will on this peaceful morning, shattering it for no other reason than because he could. The thought of the man's inevitable fear and submission was, to him, the most satisfying part of the job. Marcus watched the officer approach, his initial curiosity curdling into a knot of apprehension in his stomach. He instinctively placed his pruning shears on the grass, a subconscious gesture to show he was unarmed and posed no threat. He remained standing, his posture open and non-confrontational. "Good morning, officer," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady, though his heart was now thumping against his ribs. "Is there a problem?" Officer Cole stopped about 10 feet away, planting his feet in a wide, aggressive stance. He didn't return the greeting. He didn't introduce himself. He just stared, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe with undisguised contempt. The silence stretched for a few uncomfortable seconds, a deliberate tactic designed to unnerve. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Cole said, his voice flat and hard. Marcus blinked, confused. "My ID? I'm in my own yard. May I ask what this is about?" It was a reasonable question, the kind any citizen would ask. But to Cole, it was an act of defiance. "You fit the description of a suspect in a high-value theft that occurred downtown about an hour ago," Cole snapped, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Blackmail, 40s, dark clothing, stole a designer handbag worth more than the car in your driveway." The insult was sharp and deliberate, designed to provoke. A wave of disbelief washed over Marcus. A stolen handbag? Downtown? He hadn't left his house all morning. He gestured around him, at the freshly trimmed roses, the coffee mug on the porch, the quiet, familiar street. "Officer, with all due respect, you must have the wrong person. I've been right here, working in my garden since 7 a.m. My neighbors can confirm that." "Is that so?" Cole said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Everyone's got an alibi. I'm still going to need to see that ID. Now!" The command was sharp, leaving no room for discussion. Marcus felt a surge of indignation, but he suppressed it. He knew how these encounters could spiral out of control. He had seen the videos, read the stories. He had given his own teenage nephew the talk about how to survive a police stop. Stay calm, be respectful, comply. His mind raced. His wallet was inside the house on the kitchen counter. "Okay," he said slowly, trying to de-escalate the situation. "My wallet is just inside the front door. I can go get it for you." He took a small, hesitant step toward his porch. "Stay right where you are," Cole barked, his hand moving from his sidearm to his taser. "Don't you move! You think I'm stupid? Let you run inside and grab a weapon?" The accusation was so absurd it was almost surreal. A weapon? In his own home? "Officer, I'm just trying to comply with your request," Marcus said, his voice strained but still even. He held his hands up slightly, palms open to show he had nothing to hide. "My name is Marcus Johnson. I live here. This is my house. You can run the plates on my car. You can talk to my neighbors. There is a profound misunderstanding happening right now." Across the street, Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who had known Marcus for years, was now peering intently through her living room blinds. Down the block, the man who had been watering his petunias had put down his hose and was now watching with a concerned expression. They knew Marcus. They knew he was a kind, gentle man. What they were witnessing made no sense. Cole ignored Marcus's plea for reason. He was operating in a world of his own making, a world where his suspicions were facts and Marcus's reality was irrelevant. "I don't care what your name is. I don't care if you say you live here," Cole sneered, taking another step closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "What I see is a thief who got lucky, hiding out in a nice neighborhood where he doesn't belong. Now where's the bag?" "The bag?" Marcus was stunned. "Officer, I've told you, I don't know anything about a stolen bag." "Stop lying to me!" Cole's voice rose to a shout, shattering the last vestiges of the morning's peace. "People like you are all the same. Lie, lie, lie until you're caught red-handed. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The choice is yours." The threat was unmistakable. The hard way was coming, regardless of what Marcus said or did. This was no longer about a handbag. It was about power, prejudice, and a police officer's insatiable need to inflict humiliation. Marcus Johnson, the quiet homeowner, was trapped in a nightmare unfolding on his own front lawn, with the sun shining brightly overhead. The situation was spiraling, and Marcus knew it. Every calm, rational statement he made was being twisted into an act of defiance. Every attempt to comply was met with increased hostility. He was in a no-win scenario, a game with rules he couldn't comprehend, played against an opponent who was also the referee. He made one last attempt to appeal to reason. "Officer," he began, his voice pleading, "please just slow down. There's no need for this. We can talk this through. Call your supervisor. I am not the person you are looking for." That suggestion, the mention of a supervisor, was the spark that lit the fuse. To Ryan Cole, it was the ultimate challenge to his authority. It implied he was incapable of handling the situation, that he had made a mistake. His face, already a mask of grim determination, darkened with rage. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he bellowed, his voice echoing down the quiet street. "You lost the right to talk this through when you started giving me lip." Without any further warning, Cole closed the remaining distance between them and shoved Marcus hard in the chest with both hands. The force of the push was sudden and violent. Marcus, completely unprepared, stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the low border fence around his rose bushes. He flailed his arms for balance, but it was useless. He crashed down onto the soft grass, the impact knocking the wind out of him. A sharp pain shot through his wrist as he tried to break his fall. For a moment, he lay there, stunned, gasping for air, the world a dizzying blur of green grass and blue sky. The smell of crushed rose petals filled his nostrils. The physical assault was a clear, undeniable line being crossed. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably from a tense verbal confrontation to a physical attack. And people were watching. Mrs. Gable across the street let out a small, horrified gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The man with the hose, whose name was David, now had his phone out. He wasn't overtly filming, but held it low by his side, the camera lens pointed directly at the unfolding scene. 2 houses down, a teenager named Sarah, who had been woken up by the shouting, was now peering from her bedroom window. Her generation's instinct was immediate. She unlocked her phone and hit record. She wasn't the only one. The entire event was now being documented from at least 3 different angles, a fact of which Officer Ryan Cole was blissfully unaware. He was too consumed by his own rage, too high on the feeling of absolute power. Marcus pushed himself up onto his elbows, his head spinning. Pain radiated from his wrist, and he could feel a trickle of warmth on his forehead where it had grazed the metal fence. "What are you doing?" he managed to gasp out. "I haven't done anything. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Cole snarled, standing over him, a triumphant, menacing silhouette against the bright morning sun. "You're resisting arrest." "Resisting? I haven't been arrested. You just assaulted me." Marcus's voice was a mixture of pain, fear, and disbelief. The sheer injustice of the situation was suffocating. He was on the ground, injured, in his own front yard, being accused of a crime he didn't commit by the very person who had just attacked him. Cole unclipped the handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click sounding unnaturally loud in the tense air. "You're under arrest now for theft and for resisting a police officer." He reached down and grabbed Marcus's arm, yanking it behind his back with brutal force. The pain in Marcus's wrist intensified, and he cried out involuntarily. He didn't fight back. He didn't struggle. He knew with a chilling certainty that any form of resistance, no matter how justified, would be interpreted as aggression and would only lead to more violence. He went limp, a conscious decision to survive. He allowed the officer to wrench his other arm back, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his skin. From her window, Sarah zoomed in, her hand trembling slightly. The video was shaky, but the images were damningly clear. A uniformed officer kneeling on the back of a man who was offering no resistance, cuffing him with unnecessary force. The audio captured Marcus's pained groan and Cole's grunted words of exertion. It was raw, ugly, and irrefutable. Ryan Cole thought he was just putting another suspect in his place. In reality, he was directing, producing, and starring in a film that would systematically destroy his life. With Marcus now face down on the grass, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, Any reasonable officer would have concluded the situation was under control. The subject was subdued and compliant. The next step, according to any police manual, would be to help the individual to his feet, read him his rights, and place him in the cruiser. But Ryan Cole was not a reasonable officer. He was a bully who had been given a badge, and the fight wasn't over until his victim was thoroughly broken and humiliated. For him, the violence was not a means to an end. It was the point of the entire exercise. "Where's the purse, scumbag?" Cole growled, pressing his knee hard into Marcus's back, grinding his face into the dirt and grass. "Tell me where you stashed it." "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus wheezed, the weight on his spine making it difficult to breathe. He could taste soil and blood in his mouth. The cut on his forehead was now bleeding freely, the warm liquid dripping down his temple and matting in his hair. "Still lying!" Cole shouted. He grabbed a handful of Marcus's sweatshirt and violently yanked his head up, only to slam it back down onto the lawn. The impact was sickening, a dull thud that made Mrs. Gable flinch as if she had been struck herself. David, still filming from down the street, muttered an expletive under his breath. This was no longer an arrest. It was a savage beating. Marcus's vision swam. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over him. His body was screaming in pain, but his mind was strangely clear. In that moment of agony, a single, devastating thought crystallized. This is how it happens. This is how people die. He stopped trying to speak, stopped trying to explain. He focused all his energy on a single task: breathing. In, out, in, out. He had to survive this. Cole, however, was not finished. He stood up, pulling Marcus roughly to his knees by the chain of the handcuffs. He then searched him, which was nothing more than a series of degrading and painful pats and shoves. He found nothing in Marcus's pockets but a handkerchief and a key to his garden shed. The absence of any weapon or stolen property only seemed to infuriate Cole more. It was another contradiction to the narrative he had constructed in his mind. "You think you're smart, huh? Probably got it stashed in the house," he spat, his face inches from Marcus's. It was then that he noticed the blood. A significant amount was now flowing from the gash on Marcus's forehead, staining the collar of his sweatshirt a dark crimson. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something, perhaps professional concern, perhaps self-preservation, crossed Cole's face. He knew a visible injury could complicate his report, but the moment passed, replaced by his overriding arrogance. He would simply write in his report that the suspect had resisted violently, that he had tripped and hit his head while trying to flee. It was his word against a criminal's. He knew whose version the department would believe. He hauled Marcus to his feet. The world tilted violently for Marcus, and he stumbled, his legs unsteady. Cole held him up with one hand on the cuffs, his grip painfully tight. He began marching him towards the squad car, a public perp walk designed for maximum humiliation. This was the image that would become the indelible centerpiece of the viral videos. A bleeding, handcuffed man in his own gardening clothes being paraded across his own lawn by a smirking, triumphant police officer. Sarah's video from her elevated second-story window captured the scene perfectly. It showed the blood on Marcus's face, the pristine suburban houses in the background, and the utter lack of any threat or provocation. David's video from ground level caught the raw audio, Marcus's ragged breathing, Cole's contemptuous grunts. Mrs. Gable, too shaken to film, had instead done something else. She had picked up her phone and dialed 911. "I'm at 125 Willow Lane," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "I am watching a police officer brutally assault my neighbor, Marcus Johnson, in his front yard, for no reason. Send another car. Send a supervisor. Now!" The call was logged, time-stamped, and recorded. Another piece of irrefutable evidence had just been added to the mountain that would soon bury Officer Ryan Cole. After forcing Marcus into the back of the cruiser, slamming the door with a loud final thud, Officer Ryan Cole took a moment to compose himself. He stood by the car, deliberately turning his back on the house and the watching neighbors, and surveyed his handiwork. He saw a man, bleeding and defeated, locked in his cage. He saw a quiet street now silenced by his display of authority. He felt a deep, satisfying sense of accomplishment. In his mind, order had been restored. The anomaly had been contained. He took a deep breath, the adrenaline from the confrontation beginning to subside, replaced by a familiar, confident swagger. Now came the easy part, the paperwork. The part where he would take the chaotic, ugly reality of what had just happened and mold it into a neat, official narrative that justified his every action. He leaned against the hood of his car, pulled out his official notepad, and began to write, the words flowing with the ease of long practice. He didn't write what had actually happened. He wrote the story he needed to be true. Upon arriving at the scene, he began, I observed a male matching the description of a felony theft suspect. Subject became belligerent and uncooperative when questioned. He paused, thinking. When I attempted to detain the subject for further investigation, he became physically combative. He scribbled that down, adding a few more details for flavor. Subject shoved this officer and attempted to flee into the residence, presumably to arm himself. That was a good touch, he thought. It established Marcus as the aggressor and himself as the victim, acting in self-defense. A brief struggle ensued, he continued, during which the suspect tripped and fell, causing a minor laceration to his forehead. The word minor was key. It downplayed the injury, making it sound incidental. He glanced back at Marcus in the car. The man was slumped against the window, his eyes closed, his face pale beneath his dark skin. The bleeding seemed to have slowed, but the blood was stark against his cheek and neck. Cole felt no remorse, no pity. He felt only contempt. To him, Marcus wasn't a person. He was a problem he had solved, a statistic he was now processing. He had a file in his locker filled with commendations for his proactive policing and high arrest numbers. Those commendations were built on dozens of encounters just like this one. Encounters where his version of events was the only one that mattered. He had no reason to believe this time would be any different. The few complaints that had been filed against him over the years had evaporated into the bureaucratic ether of the Internal Affairs Department, a place he and his buddies jokingly called the memory hole. His supervisors liked his aggressive style. It made the department look tough. They had his back. A second patrol car pulled up, responding to Mrs. Gable's 911 call. A veteran officer, Sergeant Miller, stepped out. Miller was nearing retirement and had seen everything, including too many young cops like Cole. He walked over, his eyes taking in the scene. The blood on Marcus, the smug look on Cole's face, the neighbors still watching from their porches. "What's going on here, Ryan?" Miller asked, his voice tired. Cole gave him the short, confident version of his report. "Caught this guy. Fits the description of that bolo for the downtown bag snatching. Got squirrely on me when I tried to talk to him, took a swing and tried to run. Fell and hit his head." Miller looked from Cole to Marcus, then back to Cole. He saw the pristine rose bushes, the peaceful neighborhood. Something didn't add up. "He took a swing at you?" Miller asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "This guy?" "Yeah, you'd be surprised," Cole said with a shrug, refusing to meet the older officer's gaze. "They all act tough until the cuffs go on." Cole was so secure in his position, so certain of the blue wall of silence, that he didn't even feel the need to be convincing. He believed the mere fact that he was wearing a uniform and Marcus was in handcuffs was proof enough. He was the officer. His report was the official record. The story was his to write. He was invulnerable. As Sergeant Miller called in the arrest, Cole felt the last of the tension leave him. The incident was over. He'd get back to the station, file his report, and maybe grab a beer with his buddies after his shift to laugh about the thief who thought he could hide out in the suburbs. He was completely, blissfully, catastrophically unaware that in the digital world, the real story was already spreading like wildfire, about to burn his carefully constructed lies, his career, and his entire life to the ground. While Officer Cole was confidently fabricating his report, the digital evidence of his crimes was beginning its inexorable journey. Sarah, the teenager from 2 doors down, was the first to act. Her hands still shaking, she airdropped the 2-minute video clip to her two best friends with a simple, horrified message. "OMG, look what is happening on my street right now!" One of those friends immediately posted it to her TikTok account. She added a trending, dramatic audio clip and a single line of text. "Police brutality in Oak Creek. This man was gardening." That was all it took. The TikTok algorithm, designed to identify and promote highly engaging content, seized upon the video. The raw shock value, the clear image of a violent arrest in a peaceful, affluent setting, was explosive. The initial wave of views came from local teens, but within minutes, it broke containment. David, the neighbor with the hose, took a more direct approach. He uploaded his clearer, ground-level footage to Twitter, tagging the local news affiliates, the mayor's office, and a national civil rights activist group he followed. His tweet was simple and factual. "This is Marcus Johnson, a good man. This is what Officer Ryan Cole of the City Name Police Department just did to him in his own front yard. The time is 10:32 a.m. The inclusion of the names and the precise time gave it an undeniable air of authenticity. It wasn't an anonymous clip from an unknown place. It was a documented event, happening in real time. The video began to get retweets, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds. News reporters, always monitoring social media for breaking stories, saw it. They cross-referenced the officer's name with public records. They pulled up a property map for the address. The story was real. By noon, less than 2 hours after the assault, the story was the lead item on the websites of every local news station. The headlines were stark. "Video shows officer violently arresting man in his own yard." By 1 p.m., national news outlets had picked it up. The Associated Press wrote a story. It appeared on CNN's homepage. The hashtag, #Justice for Marcus Johnson was born and began trending nationwide. Millions of people were now watching Officer Ryan Cole slam a compliant, unarmed man's face into the grass. They were watching from their office desks, on their lunch breaks, on buses, and in coffee shops. The videos, now merged and edited together from the different angles, played on a continuous loop, a digital nightmare from which Cole could not escape. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was shifting from routine Saturday business to full-blown crisis management. The phone started ringing off the hook. First, it was local reporters. Then the mayor's office called, demanding an explanation. The police chief, a political appointee named Michael Vernon, was in the middle of a golf game when his phone began buzzing incessantly. He saw the video for the first time on his phone in the clubhouse, and the color drained from his face. He knew, instantly, that this was not a containable incident. This was a Category 5 hurricane, and it was heading straight for his department. He barked orders into his phone. "Get Cole off the street, now! Confiscate his body cam footage. Internal Affairs needs to launch an immediate investigation, and get our PR team to draft a statement. Say we're aware of the video and taking it seriously." But it was already too late for carefully worded press releases. The public wasn't just angry, they were incandescent with rage. The comment sections on the news sites and social media platforms exploded. "He was tending his roses," one user wrote. Another commented, "The look on that cop's face. He's enjoying it. That's a monster, not a police officer." Marcus Johnson's identity quickly became known. Friends, former colleagues, and neighbors began posting messages of support, painting a picture of a kind, creative, and gentle man. This narrative, the story of a good man brutalized for no reason, stood in devastating contrast to the official police language of resisting arrest. The court of public opinion had convened, reviewed the evidence, and reached a unanimous verdict long before any official investigation could even begin. Officer Ryan Cole was guilty. The only question left was what his punishment would be. The digital wildfire was out of control, and it was no longer just burning Ryan Cole. It was threatening to consume the entire police department that had allowed a man like him to wear a badge. By Monday morning, the Marcus Johnson case had transcended a viral moment and become a national referendum on policing in America. Protesters had gathered outside the police headquarters over the weekend, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. The story was the top headline on every major network, with legal analysts and former prosecutors dissecting the videos frame by agonizing frame. The local police department's attempts at damage control were proving catastrophically inept. Chief Vernon's initial statement, a bland concoction of bureaucratic jargon about an ongoing internal investigation and a commitment to transparency, was met with widespread ridicule and scorn. The public had seen the video. They didn't need an internal investigation to tell them what their own eyes had confirmed. The pressure was immense, not just on the local government, but on a federal level. The call came from Washington, D.C. on Monday afternoon. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, acting on an unprecedented number of complaints and direct pressure from several congressional members, officially informed Chief Vernon that they were opening a federal investigation into the arrest of Marcus Johnson. They were invoking their authority to investigate patterns or practices of unconstitutional policing. This single act changed the entire landscape of the case. The investigation was no longer in the hands of the local police department, an organization with a clear interest in protecting its own. It was now in the hands of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, an agency with vast resources, subpoena power, and a mandate to prosecute civil rights violations to the fullest extent of the law. The federal hammer was about to fall. 2 FBI special agents arrived at the precinct the next morning. They weren't there to cooperate, they were there to take over. Their lead was Special Agent Franklin Thorne, a veteran of the Civil Rights Division with a reputation for being meticulous, relentless, and completely immune to the pressures of the blue wall of silence. He had successfully prosecuted dozens of corrupt officers across the country, and he carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who knew the law was on his side. He and his partner walked into Chief Vernon's office and presented him with a federal subpoena. It didn't ask for records, it demanded them. They wanted everything related to Officer Ryan Cole, his entire personnel file, every use of force report he had ever filed, every citizen complaint lodged against him, his training records, his psychological evaluations, and all internal communications regarding his conduct. They also demanded all footage from Cole's body camera and the dash cam of his vehicle, as well as the 911 call logs from the incident. The atmosphere in the police department became thick with fear. The feds weren't just investigating Ryan Cole, they were investigating the department itself. They were looking for the very thing Chief Vernon and his predecessors had spent years sweeping under the rug: a pattern. They wanted to know how a man like Ryan Cole could operate with such impunity for so long. Who had dismissed the complaints against him? Which supervisors had signed off on his glowing performance reviews while ignoring the warning signs? Who was responsible for creating the culture that allowed this to happen? Suddenly, every officer who had ever covered for Cole, every sergeant who had ever looked the other way, was a potential target of a federal obstruction of justice charge. The blue wall of silence began to crack under the immense pressure. Ryan Cole, who had been placed on administrative leave, found himself completely isolated. The buddies who had clapped him on the back and shared beers with him were now avoiding his calls. The union representative who had promised to protect him now spoke in cautious, non-committal terms. He had hired a lawyer, a local hotshot known for getting cops off on technicalities, but even the lawyer sounded worried. The game had changed. This wasn't a local DA he could intimidate or a jury he could fool with police jargon. This was the United States Department of Justice. As Agent Thorne's team began their work, meticulously collecting evidence and scheduling interviews, a palpable sense of dread settled over the city's police force. They had protected one of their own for too long, and now the bill was coming due. The federal government was here to collect, and they would not be denied. Special Agent Thorne's investigation began with the mountain of files subpoenaed from the police department's records room. For days, he and his team worked out of a sterile conference room, piecing together the professional life of Officer Ryan Cole. What they discovered was not the story of a good cop who had one bad day. It was the story of a predator who had been allowed to hunt with a badge for nearly a decade. The official personnel file was deceptively clean, filled with commendations and satisfactory performance reviews. But the real story was in the documents the department had tried to bury. The citizen complaint files. There were 8 of them in total over 7 years. 8 separate incidents where citizens had formally accused Ryan Cole of excessive force, illegal searches, or racially motivated harassment. And every single one followed a chillingly similar pattern. A 20-year-old black college student pulled over for having a too loud exhaust pipe, then dragged from his car and slammed against the hood for acting disrespectfully. A Hispanic family having a barbecue in a public park accused by Cole of being gang members and illegally searched, their food thrown on the ground. A black lawyer, a woman in her 50s, stopped in her own driveway and forced to prove she lived in her house because Cole insisted her luxury car must be stolen. In every case, the victims were minorities. In every case, Cole's official report painted them as aggressive, non-compliant, and a threat. And in every single case, the internal affairs investigation had cleared him of all wrongdoing. The complaints were ruled unfounded or unsubstantiated, the word of a decorated officer taking precedence over the citizens he had victimized. The investigators dug deeper. They re-interviewed the complainants from those old cases. People who had long given up on justice were suddenly telling their stories to federal agents who listened, who took notes, and who believed them. The college student, now a teacher, spoke of the humiliation he felt. The father from the barbecue broke down in tears, recalling how his young children had been terrified. The lawyer provided a detailed, articulate account of Cole's sneering contempt. These weren't just stories. They were evidence of a clear, undeniable pattern of behavior. Cole specifically targeted minorities in affluent areas, places he believed they didn't belong, and used his authority to harass and intimidate them. The most damning discovery came from an anonymous tip. A disgruntled former officer, hearing the feds were in town, called the FBI's hotline. He told them to look for a specific incident report from 3 years prior, one that had been officially lost. The report detailed an off-duty bar fight where Cole had beaten a man so severely he required facial reconstructive surgery. The victim, who was white, had pressed charges. But the charges were mysteriously dropped after the investigating sergeant, one of Cole's closest friends on the force, concluded it was mutual combat. The FBI retrieved the lost report from a deep archive. It was a smoking gun, proof of a deliberate criminal cover-up designed to protect a violent officer from facing consequences. The sergeant who wrote that report was immediately placed under investigation for obstruction of justice. The picture of Ryan Cole that emerged was that of a ticking time bomb. The department hadn't just failed to discipline him, they had actively enabled him. Supervisors had praised his proactive style, ignoring the racial bias inherent in his traffic stops. The union had aggressively defended him against every complaint, no matter how credible. The system hadn't just failed, it had worked exactly as it was designed to, protecting its own at the expense of the public. The assault on Marcus Johnson wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable, predictable culmination of a long and sordid history of unchecked brutality. Agent Thorne now had more than enough to indict Ryan Cole, but his investigation had grown. He was no longer just building a case against one rogue cop. He was building a case against the entire corrupt institution that had created him. With the evidence assembled by Agent Thorne's team, the case was presented to a federal grand jury. This was not a trial to determine guilt, but a secret proceeding to determine if there was enough probable cause to bring official charges. For 3 days, the panel of 16 ordinary citizens sat in a closed room and listened. They saw the multiple videos of the assault on Marcus Johnson, each angle more damning than the last. They heard the raw audio from Mrs. Gable's 911 call, her voice trembling with rage as she described the brutality. They listened to the testimony of the victims from Cole's past, the teacher, the lawyer, the father, who each recounted their own stories of humiliation and abuse at his hands. Finally, they heard from Agent Thorne himself, who laid out the evidence of the departmental cover-up, showing a clear pattern of ignored complaints and falsified reports. The grand jury's deliberation was remarkably short. It took them less than 2 hours to return what is known as a true bill. The indictment they handed down was a legal sledgehammer. Officer Ryan Cole was charged with 5 separate federal crimes. Deprivation of rights under color of law, a charge specifically for officials who abuse their power. Falsification of a police report, a felony. Perjury, for lying in his initial sworn statement, and 2 counts of assault. The charges carried a combined maximum sentence of over 20 years in federal prison. The indictment was unsealed, and the news exploded. A decorated police officer was now a federal defendant. He was ordered to surrender his badge and his firearms and was released on bail, a free man for now, but with the full weight of the United States government bearing down on him. While the criminal case was moving forward, the civil battle was just beginning. Marcus Johnson, still recovering physically and emotionally from the ordeal, knew he was in over his head. The world of lawsuits and depositions was completely foreign to him. That's when he got a call from Evelyn Reed. Reed was more than just a lawyer. She was a legend in the world of civil rights litigation. At 60 years old, she had spent her entire career fighting against police misconduct and systemic injustice, winning landmark cases that had forced reform in cities across the country. She was brilliant, tenacious, and had a reputation for striking fear into the hearts of city attorneys. She had seen the video of Marcus's assault and told him she wanted to represent him, pro bono. Their first meeting took place in Reed's downtown office. Marcus, quiet and still shaken, recounted the events of that morning. Evelyn Reed listened without interrupting, her expression a mixture of deep empathy and cold fury. When he was finished, she looked him in the eye. "Marcus," she said, her voice firm but kind, "what happened to you was not just wrong, it was a crime, and it was the predictable result of a system that has been allowed to rot from the inside. We are not just going to sue this officer. We are going to sue the city, the police department, and every supervisor who enabled him. We are not just going to ask for money, we are going to demand change. Real, structural, enforceable change. But I need to know if you are ready for this fight. They will come after you. They will try to dig up dirt on you, to paint you as a villain, to discredit you. It will be ugly." Marcus looked at the woman sitting across from him. For the first time since the assault, he felt a flicker of something other than fear or pain. He felt hope. He felt strength. He thought about the other victims, the ones whose stories had been buried for years. He thought about his nephew and all the other young men who lived in fear of a routine traffic stop. This was no longer just about him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice finding a new resolve. "I'm ready to fight." In that moment, an unbreakable alliance was forged. On one side, a corrupt officer and the broken system that protected him. On the other, a quiet man with unshakable dignity and the most formidable civil rights attorney in the nation. The battle lines were drawn. Faced with a federal indictment and the legal prowess of Evelyn Reed, Ryan Cole and his defense team were backed into a corner. The video evidence was irrefutable. The testimony of past victims painted a damning picture of his character. A straightforward defense was impossible. So, they chose the only path available to desperate men. They decided to attack the victim. Their strategy was as old as it was ugly. If you can't challenge the evidence, you destroy the credibility of the person the evidence is about. They hired a team of private investigators to dig into every corner of Marcus Johnson's life, searching for any secret, any mistake, any skeleton they could drag into the courtroom to tarnish his image. They were looking for the classic tropes: a hidden criminal record, a history of drug use, a past allegation of violence, financial trouble, a messy divorce. Anything they could use to suggest to a jury that Marcus was not the gentle, law-abiding man he appeared to be, but rather a troubled individual with a propensity for aggression. They believed that if they could plant even a seed of doubt about Marcus's character, they could argue that he provoked the confrontation, that Officer Cole was reacting to a perceived threat, not acting out of prejudice. It was a vile, cynical strategy, and it was doomed to fail spectacularly. The private investigators came back with nothing. Marcus Johnson's life was exactly as it appeared. Clean. He had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. His credit was excellent. His business records were immaculate. His ex-wife, when contacted, spoke of him with respect and admiration, calling their divorce amicable and describing him as a kind and peaceful man. Neighbors, friends, and clients all told the same story. Marcus Johnson was a man of integrity and quiet grace. The defense team was left with absolutely nothing to work with. Undeterred, they manufactured a new line of attack. In pretrial motions, Cole's attorney, a man named Bill Foreman, filed a request to introduce evidence of Marcus's potential for aggression. This evidence consisted of two things. First, a single noise complaint filed by a neighbor 3 years ago when Marcus was hosting a small 4th of July barbecue. The complaint had been resolved peacefully in minutes. Second, they had found a post on one of Marcus's social media accounts from 5 years prior where he had expressed support for a protest movement against police brutality. Foreman argued that this proved Marcus harbored anti-police sentiments and was therefore predisposed to be non-compliant and hostile towards law enforcement. The pretrial hearing on this motion was a disaster for the defense. Evelyn Reed stood before the federal judge and systematically dismantled Foreman's arguments with surgical precision. "Your Honor," she began, her voice dripping with controlled contempt, "the defense is asking this court to accept a ludicrous and offensive premise. They are suggesting that because my client once hosted a barbecue and believes that police should be held accountable for their actions, he somehow deserved to be beaten and have his civil rights violated on his own front lawn. This is not a legal argument. It is a desperate, pathetic smear tactic. It is an attempt to put the victim on trial because they have no defense for the actions of the accused." The judge, a no-nonsense veteran of the federal bench, clearly agreed. He looked down at Bill Foreman, his face a mask of stern disapproval. "Mr. Foreman," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "what I see here is an attempt to chill free speech and to punish a man for exercising his First Amendment rights. Your motion is not just denied, it is denied with prejudice. And I am warning you, if you attempt to bring this kind of baseless character assassination into my courtroom during the trial, I will consider sanctioning you for prosecutorial misconduct. Is that understood?" Foreman, pale and sweating, could only stammer, "Yes, Your Honor." The entire defense strategy had been incinerated before the trial even began. They were left with no witnesses, no counter-narrative, and no credibility. All they had was their client, Ryan Cole, and the mountain of video evidence that showed him for exactly what he was, a violent, racist bully who had finally been caught. The stage was set for a trial that would be less of a legal battle and more of a public execution of a career and a reputation. The first day of the trial of United States v. Ryan Cole felt like the epicenter of a national event. The federal courthouse was besieged by news vans and satellite trucks. A crowd of protesters and supporters filled the plaza outside, their chants for justice audible even inside the marble halls. Inside the courtroom, every seat was taken. Marcus Johnson sat in the front row with Evelyn Reed, his expression calm and composed. Across the aisle, Ryan Cole sat at the defense table, looking smaller and less imposing without his uniform and swagger. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, avoiding the dozens of eyes that were fixed on him. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp and focused prosecutor named Maria Flores, began her opening statement with devastating simplicity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice clear and strong, This is not a complicated case. This is not a case about nuanced legal theories or conflicting accounts of events. This is a case about what you can see with your own eyes. She turned and gestured towards the large screens that had been set up in the courtroom. The evidence in this case is not just compelling, it is absolute. You will see and you will hear the defendant, a sworn police officer, betray his oath, violate the Constitution, and brutally assault an innocent man for no reason other than the color of his skin. The prosecution's first move was to play the videos. Flores synchronized the footage from Sarah's window, David's phone, and the police cruiser's dash cam, playing them simultaneously on a split screen. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The jurors were transfixed, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. They saw the peaceful morning, the polite greeting from Marcus. They heard Cole's aggressive, baseless accusations. They watched him shove an unarmed man to the ground. They witnessed the brutal takedown, the knee in the back, the head slammed into the lawn. They heard Marcus's pained groans and Cole's venomous snarls. The video footage was even more powerful in the sterile, formal environment of the courtroom than it had been on social media. Stripped of commentary and hashtags, it was just the raw, ugly truth. Several jurors visibly flinched during the most violent moments. One woman put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. By the time the videos ended, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Ryan Cole was no longer just a defendant. He was the villain from the movie they had all just watched. The prosecution then began to build their case, brick by brick. They called the 911 dispatcher to the stand, who authenticated the recording of Mrs. Gable's frantic call. They played the audio for the jury, and everyone heard her say, "I am watching a police officer brutally assault my neighbor, for no reason." Then they called Sergeant Miller, the supervising officer who had arrived on the scene. He testified under oath that Cole had lied to him, claiming Marcus had taken a swing at him. "Did you see any evidence that Mr. Johnson had been aggressive?" Flores asked. "No, ma'am," Miller replied, his voice heavy. "He was bleeding. He was in cuffs. He looked scared." The final witness of the day was the records clerk from the police department who had received the initial theft report. Flores put the report up on the screen. "Please read the description of the suspect provided by the victim," she asked. The clerk read, "Black male, maybe in his 40s, wearing dark clothes. No other details were provided." "And where did this theft occur?" Flores asked. "Downtown, at the corner of 5th and Main," the clerk replied. "And where is the defendant's home?" 125 Willow Lane. "That is in Oak Creek Estates. It's approximately 9 miles north of that location." The point was devastatingly clear. Ryan Cole had acted on the vaguest possible description, miles from the crime scene, and had targeted the first black man he saw in a wealthy neighborhood. The foundation of his entire action was nothing but pure, unadulterated racial profiling. As the court adjourned for the day, Ryan Cole's attorney stared down at his legal pad, on which he had not written a single word. He knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that his case had just been lost, and the prosecution's most powerful witness had not even taken the stand yet. The next day, the prosecution called Marcus Johnson to the witness stand. A hush fell over the courtroom as he made his way to the front. He was dressed in a simple, well-tailored dark suit, and he moved with a quiet composure that seemed to fill the room. He looked directly at the jury as he took the oath, his voice steady and clear. For the next 4 hours, guided by Prosecutor Maria Flores, he walked the jury through every moment of that horrific morning. He didn't speak with anger or bitterness. He spoke with a kind of sad, factual precision that was far more powerful. He described the beauty of the morning, the simple joy he felt tending to his roses. He recounted Officer Cole's arrival, the immediate hostility, the baseless accusation. "He looked at me," Marcus said, his voice soft but firm, "not like he was seeing a person or a homeowner or a citizen. He looked at me like I was something that didn't belong, something that needed to be removed." He described the assault not in dramatic terms, but by detailing what he felt. When he shoved me, I was completely surprised. I remember thinking about my roses, hoping I hadn't crushed them. When my head hit the grass, I remember the smell of the earth. And I remember thinking, I have to stay calm. If I get angry, if I struggle, he will have an excuse. This testimony was devastating. It stripped Ryan Cole of his fabricated justification of a resisting suspect and recast the event for what it was: a calculated attack on a man who was consciously trying to de-escalate and survive. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, Bill Foreman approached the stand. His only hope was to rattle Marcus, to provoke an emotional outburst that he could then portray as aggression. He began with a series of condescending questions. "Mr. Johnson, you run a business from your home, is that correct? A graphic design business? So you spend a lot of time alone." The implication was clear, that Marcus was an isolated, perhaps unstable individual. Marcus simply replied, "I work from home, yes. It allows me to be a productive member of society." Foreman tried another angle. "You were upset that a police officer was questioning you in your neighborhood, weren't you? You felt he was disrespecting you." "I was confused," Marcus corrected him gently. "I had done nothing wrong. I believe any citizen would be confused in that situation. I was not upset. I was trying to understand." Foreman grew more aggressive. "Isn't it true that you refused a lawful order to provide identification?" "That's not true," Marcus said calmly. "I told the officer my identification was inside my house. I offered to get it. He refused to let me move." "So you argued with him," Foreman said, his voice rising, pointing a finger at Marcus. "No, sir," Marcus replied, his gaze never wavering. "I attempted to have a conversation. Officer Cole was the only person who was arguing." The cross-examination went on like this for an hour. Foreman tried to twist Marcus's words, to trip him up, to paint his calm compliance as defiance. But it was like trying to punch water. Marcus's quiet dignity was an impenetrable shield. He answered every question truthfully and without emotion. He never raised his voice. He never showed anger. He simply told his truth, over and over again. The jury watched the exchange intently. They saw a desperate lawyer trying to bully a witness, and they saw a man of incredible grace and self-control refusing to be baited. Ryan Cole's defense was not just failing, it was making him look even more guilty. By trying to portray Marcus as an aggressive man, they only succeeded in highlighting his remarkable peacefulness in the face of extreme provocation. Finally, Foreman, visibly frustrated and out of questions, said, "No further questions, Your Honor." As Marcus stepped down from the stand, a quiet ripple of respect moved through the courtroom. He had faced his attacker again, not with violence, but with truth. He had not only told his story, but he had also embodied it. His testimony was the final, unshakable pillar in the prosecution's ironclad case. Ryan Cole slumped in his chair, a man who finally seemed to understand that he was not just on trial, he was already condemned. The defense's case was brief and pathetic. They called two of Cole's fellow officers to the stand as character witnesses. Both testified that Cole was a dedicated and proactive cop, but their testimony crumbled under the prosecution's cross-examination. Maria Flores forced them to admit they had seen the videos and that Cole's actions were not consistent with their training. When asked if they had ever witnessed Cole display racial bias, they stammered and equivocated, their loyalty to the blue wall visibly warring with their sworn oath to tell the truth. Ryan Cole, on the advice of his attorney, did not take the stand. He knew that under Flores's relentless questioning, his carefully constructed lies would fall apart in minutes. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The defense attorney offered a weak, meandering speech about the difficult decisions police officers have to make in split-second situations. He tried to portray Cole as a victim of a viral video, taken out of context. The jury looked bored and unconvinced. Then, Maria Flores stood up for her final address. She walked directly in front of the jury box. "For 3 days we have talked about what happened on the morning of June 12th, she said, her voice quiet but resonant. "But in the end, this case is simple. Look at the defendant Ryan Cole. Then look at Marcus Johnson. One of these men acted with violence, with hatred, and with a flagrant disregard for the law. The other acted with dignity, with patience, and with grace under unimaginable pressure. Your job is not to judge a viral video. Your job is to uphold the Constitution of the United States, the very document this defendant swore an oath to protect and then trampled into the dirt on Mr. Johnson's lawn. Find him guilty. Send a message that this behavior will not be tolerated. Not here, not anywhere. The jury filed out. They returned in just 90 minutes. The speed of their decision sent a ripple of anticipation through the packed courtroom. Ryan Cole stood as the jury foreman handed the verdict to the clerk. Cole's face was ashen, his bravado gone, replaced by the stark terror of a man facing the abyss. The clerk unfolded the paper and read the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp, followed by quiet sobs of relief from Marcus's supporters, filled the room. The clerk continued. On the charge of falsification of a police report, guilty. On the charge of perjury, guilty. On every single count, the verdict was the same, guilty. Ryan Cole's legs seemed to buckle, and he had to be held up by his attorney. It was over. The sentencing hearing was held a month later. The same federal judge who had warned the defense about their smear tactics now presided over Cole's fate. He had read dozens of victim impact statements, not just from Marcus, but from the other people Cole had terrorized over the years. Marcus Johnson chose not to speak, allowing his testimony at trial to be his final word. Judge Harrison looked down at Ryan Cole, who stood before him in a drab suit, a convicted felon stripped of his power and pride. "Mr. Cole," the judge began, his voice ringing with judicial authority, "you did more than just assault a man. You assaulted the very foundations of our justice system. You used the shield of public trust as a weapon of private prejudice. You betrayed your oath, your community, and every decent officer who wears the uniform with honor. The damage you have caused cannot be measured in dollars. It is measured in the erosion of faith between the people and those sworn to protect them." The judge paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This court must send a message. The message is that there are no special rules for law enforcement. The law applies to everyone. Therefore, it is the sentence of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term of 10 years. A loud gasp echoed through the courtroom. 10 years. It was a sentence far harsher than anyone had expected. It was a landmark. Legal experts watching on the news would call it one of the stiffest sentences ever handed down to a police officer for a non-lethal civil rights violation. As U.S. Marshals moved forward to take a stunned Ryan Cole into custody, a powerful message was sent to police departments across the nation. Accountability is no longer a suggestion. It is a mandate. And sometimes, justice, when it finally arrives, is swift, severe, and absolute. Ryan Cole's life imploded with the finality of a collapsing star. He was immediately taken into federal custody, trading his police uniform for a prison jumpsuit. His appeal, filed by his beleaguered attorney, was quickly denied. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. He was transferred to a medium-security federal prison several states away, a standard procedure for former law enforcement officers who are often targets in the general prison population. His new reality was a cramped cell, the rigid, monotonous routine of prison life, and the constant, low-level fear of being recognized. The power he had once wielded was gone, replaced by the absolute powerlessness of an inmate. His wife divorced him within the year, taking their children and moving to a different state to escape the notoriety of his name. The friends from the force who had once been his staunchest defenders vanished, their loyalty dissolving in the face of a federal conviction. He was utterly alone, left with nothing but 10 long years to contemplate how his own hatred had cost him everything. While the criminal justice system dealt with Cole, the civil court system was dealing with the institution that created him. Evelyn Reed, true to her word, had filed a massive federal civil rights lawsuit against the city and its police department. Her case was built not just on the brutal assault of Marcus Johnson, but on the well-documented history of Cole's abuse and the department's deliberate indifference to it. She argued that the city had a clear policy and practice of failing to train, supervise, and discipline its officers, thereby enabling the violation of citizens' constitutional rights. Faced with the mountain of evidence gathered by the FBI and the prospect of a long, humiliating, and astronomically expensive trial they were certain to lose, the city's attorneys quickly moved to settle. The negotiations were intense, but Evelyn Reed held all the cards. The final settlement was historic. The city agreed to pay Marcus Johnson $15 million, one of the largest settlements for a single plaintiff in the state's history. But as Reed had promised, the money was only part of the victory. The core of the settlement was a legally binding consent decree, overseen by the Department of Justice, that would force a complete and total overhaul of the police department. The terms of the decree were sweeping. It mandated the implementation of a new independent civilian complaint review board with the power to investigate and recommend discipline. It required every single officer, from the chief down to the newest recruit, to undergo extensive annual training on de-escalation, implicit bias, and constitutional policing. The department's use of force policies were to be completely rewritten with input from community leaders. An early warning system was to be implemented to flag officers like Ryan Cole, who accumulated multiple complaints, for mandatory retraining and psychological review. Body cameras became mandatory for every officer, and the footage was subject to random audits by the civilian board. The financial and political fallout for the city was immense. The $15 million settlement, combined with millions more in legal fees and the cost of implementing the consent decree, blew a massive hole in the city's budget, forcing cuts to other services. The police chief was fired. The mayor, facing a recall effort, announced he would not seek re-election. The entire command structure of the police department was dismantled and rebuilt under the watchful eye of a federal monitor. The culture of impunity had been shattered, brought down by one man's prejudice and another man's quiet dignity. The price of protecting a monster like Ryan Cole had finally come due, and the city was forced to pay it in full, in both treasure and reputation. The department that emerged from the ashes would be unrecognizable from the one that had tried to destroy Marcus Johnson. Marcus Johnson could have taken his settlement money and disappeared. No one would have blamed him. He could have moved to a new city, bought a new house, and spent the rest of his life trying to forget the trauma that had been inflicted upon him. But Marcus was not that kind of man. The ordeal had changed him. It had taken away his sense of security, but it had given him something unexpected in return: a voice. He realized that his story, amplified by the national spotlight, had a unique power. It could be used to ensure that what happened to him would not happen to others. He felt a profound responsibility to honor the countless other victims who never had a viral video or a federal investigation to validate their truth. He started small, speaking at local community meetings and church groups. He told his story with the same calm, powerful dignity he had displayed on the witness stand. He didn't preach hatred or revenge. He spoke of understanding, accountability, and the desperate need for reform. His message resonated deeply. He soon found himself in high demand, speaking at national conferences on civil rights and police reform. He became a reluctant but powerful public figure, his gentle demeanor and articulate message a compelling counterpoint to the angry, polarized debates that dominated the issue. He used a portion of his settlement to establish the Johnson Foundation for Justice, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal support for victims of police misconduct and funding community-based policing initiatives. About a year after the trial, he received a phone call that stunned him. It was from the new police chief, a reformer brought in from another city to oversee the implementation of the consent decree. She had an audacious proposal. She asked Marcus if he would consider joining the new Civilian Complaint Review Board as a community advisor. More than that, she wanted him to speak directly to the new classes of police recruits at the academy, to tell them his story, to make them understand the human cost of the abuse of power. The idea of walking back into the world that had caused him so much pain was terrifying, but it was also an opportunity he knew he could not refuse. It was a chance to be part of the solution, to help build the kind of police force he and his community deserved. He accepted. His first speech at the police academy was one of the most difficult things he had ever done. He stood before a room of young, eager recruits, the future of the department, and he did not hold back. He showed them the photos of his injuries. He made them listen to the audio of his arrest. He made them look him in the eye as he described his fear and humiliation. "When you put on this uniform," he told them, his voice thick with emotion but unwavering, "you are given immense power. You have the power to protect, but you also have the power to destroy. The man who arrested me chose to destroy. I am asking you, begging you, to choose differently. See the humanity in everyone you encounter. Be the officer I needed that day. Be the officer this city deserves." By the end of his speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. His story became a cornerstone of the Academy's training, a permanent and powerful lesson in empathy and accountability. Marcus Johnson, the quiet graphic designer who loved his roses, had transformed his deepest trauma into a legacy of change, helping to heal the very department that had once tried to break him. However, as we reflect on this intense journey, it's crucial to look back at the beginning and ask, why? What festered inside a man like Ryan Cole that led him to unleash such unprovoked hatred on a peaceful Saturday morning? His actions weren't born from a split-second decision, but from a slow, burning poison in his soul. It was likely a toxic cocktail of insecurity, resentment, and a desperate craving for a dominance he felt was lacking in his own life. Seeing Marcus Johnson, a successful black man living peacefully in an affluent neighborhood, didn't just contradict his prejudiced worldview, it threatened it. Marcus's very existence was an affront to the fragile sense of superiority Cole needed to feel whole. The badge didn't create this ugliness. It merely gave him a license to act on it, to turn his internal inadequacy into external violence against a man who represented everything he secretly resented. Could Marcus have done anything differently? It's a question that haunts many victims. What if he had immediately run inside to get his wallet instead of trying to talk? Cole likely would have claimed he was fleeing and used it to justify tackling him through his own front door. What if he had been more forceful, angrily demanding a supervisor from the start? Cole would have twisted that anger into aggression and used it as the pretext for the assault he was already determined to commit. The chilling truth is that Marcus was in an impossible situation. He did everything right. He remained calm, he was respectful, he tried to de-escalate, and he was brutalized anyway. His survival was a testament to his incredible self-control, not a flaw in his response. His best defense, tragically, was not his words, but the hidden cameras of his neighbors who bore silent witness. The story of Marcus Johnson and Ryan Cole is a powerful reminder that injustice thrives in darkness but shrivels in the light. It teaches us that the actions of one hateful individual can be amplified by a system that chooses silence over accountability. But it also shows us that the courage of one good person, armed with the truth, can be enough to bring that corrupt system to its knees. The ultimate message is one of resilient hope, that trauma does not have to be the end of the story. It can be transformed into a catalyst for profound and lasting change, turning a victim into a leader, and a moment of darkness into a beacon for justice. This was a heavy story, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you believe a sentence like the one Ryan Cole received is truly enough to deter this kind of behavior in the future? And what do you think is the most critical element needed for real, lasting police reform in a community? Let me know your perspective in the comments below, and if you believe in the power of these stories, please consider supporting the channel.